Welcome back. In the last mini lecture, I talked about the Glorious Revolution, about the British Bill of Rights. And the significance is that the Glorious Revolution and the British Bill of Rights really laid out a new contractual and organizational pattern for British politics, and that was that Parliament would be supreme. There also were some individual liberties that were enshrined that I talked about: protection from cruel and unusual punishment, fair trial, excessive bail was prohibited, and some others. But in reality, the main significance of the Glorious Revolution is that Parliament would be supreme. Parliament got the power of the purse and the power of the sword, both of which I talked about. And we saw that at the very end of the mini lecture when I mentioned that when Parliament went out and sought King George I, and of course, King George I is the ancestor to the current royal family. And some things that Roskin leaves out that I think are really, really intriguing is that the Parliament bypassed 56 Catholics who really had superior hereditary claims. But as I pointed out in the last lecture, in that 1701 law, right, in Britain, the 1701 Act of Settlement, the law prohibited Catholics from becoming monarchs. There was a fear that the descendants of the Stuarts would try to reclaim the throne, would try to reclaim divine right, and would try to take away power from the Parliament. So George I was actually the closest Protestant relative alive, and so he was like number 57. And yet he was the one that was chosen. Now, to demonstrate that there was still tremendous strife and tremendous division between Catholics and Protestants, the coronation of King George I was accompanied by rioting in over 20 British cities as a protest against what many, mainly Catholic people, believed was an illegitimate executive. And certainly we know all about protests over what is perceived as an illegitimate executive. Certainly, that was what was at the center of the Capitol March. And even though factually the election was fair, there was no significant fraud, and even though Trump lost the election, remember that politics is about perception, not reality. And in America, there is a large number of people, a significant number of people, who do not believe that Donald Trump lost the last presidential election. And if that's true, they think that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president. So certainly we have a group of people who feel the way the Brits did about King George I. To me, the most significant aspect of King George I, and this is what I would put some stars next to if you're keeping track of this for potential test-taking purposes. To me, the significance of King George I is that there was a significant decrease in the monarch and monarchy, and that Britain, shortly after George I becomes the king of England. I'm getting ahead of myself to the prime minister, but when King George I becomes the monarch, he very, very quickly is going to establish cabinet government and is going to establish a kind of first in charge, particularly since King George I goes abroad a lot. He goes back to Hanover. In fact, an interesting, at least interesting to me, tidbit is King George I is the last British monarch that is buried in another country. King George I, when he dies, he is buried back in his native Hanover, in what today is Germany. So with King George I, you begin to see this transition to what I would call modern cabinet government led by a prime minister. And I'm going to talk about Sir Robert Walpole and the rise of the prime minister next. So in your notes, you see the rise of the prime minister. Your book mentions, and I'll repeat, that George I was very limited when he became King of England. He was a native German speaker. He didn't speak any English. And as I mentioned before, he was a German at heart. He wanted to go home a lot. Because he couldn't speak English, it was difficult to communicate with advisors. He had to go through translators. And so George I created a new administrative model that looks very, very familiar to Americans. It's a model that we have in Washington, D.C. He established a cabinet presided over by ministers who would oversee the major administrative agencies of government. It sounds very familiar. George Washington went to the Congress when he became the first president, and George Washington told the Congress that I cannot govern the executive branch by myself. I need some assistants who will oversee the major agencies of government. And so, even though the cabinet is not mentioned in the American Constitution, the cabinet has been around since the very beginning, since 1789, when George Washington became president. So, certainly, once again, here's another parallel between the British government and the American government. Obviously, the difference is that on a day-to-day basis in Britain, the cabinet is overseen by a prime minister, and of course, in America, the cabinet is overseen by the president. Now, even though Roskin and virtually every author I've ever used, every textbook I've used, uses the term prime minister and associates it with Sir Robert Walpole, who is in your notes, I would just point out that Sir Robert Walpole did not use this term. This term comes about much later. The first use of the term prime minister in the House of Commons itself was not until 1805. The term was actually not used by a British prime minister until 1878, when Prime Minister Disraeli used the term when signing the Berlin Treaty. And if you're just curious about what the Berlin Treaty was, the Berlin Treaty was the treaty that essentially carved Africa up into spheres of influence. And so essentially Africa was divided up into Anglophone Africa, that would be English-speaking Africa. This would be places like Nigeria, Ghana, for example. Sierra Leone would be another example. Francophone, French-speaking Africa, a whole bunch of areas. Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria would be the most famous French colony in Africa. Of course, Lusophone would be Portuguese-speaking Africa. Angola would be an example of that. There was German Southwest Africa, that's now Namibia, for example. And so this was a major treaty amongst the European colonizers, and that's where Benjamin Disraeli used that term for the first time. But the academics, and I'm going to join them, although you know that sometimes I like to poke fun at the academics, but the first person who almost is universally, and I haven't found anyone who's disagreed with this, so I probably should say universally, the first person who's perceived to be the first Prime Minister of Great Britain is Sir Robert Walpole. You should know his name for exam purposes. If I were to ask about Walpole, it might be who's generally considered to be the first Prime Minister, or Sir Robert Walpole was the longest serving Prime Minister in British history. Now, the prime minister under Walpole took on a variety of functions. In fact, before 1721, Walpole was the Lord High Treasurer who oversaw economic policy, and economics was of particular interest to Walpole, and Walpole had a lot of expertise in this area. Eventually, Walpole becomes Lord Treasurer, Chancellor of the Exchequer. That would be like being the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States, leader of the House of Commons. There was widespread perception by people in Britain, and King George I was one of these people who perceived that he had great business sense. He actually helped lead Britain out of an economic crisis when he was Lord High Treasurer. He also saw the country through another downturn while he was what we would call prime minister. And it was proved to many people that Walpole was a capable manager and that a prime minister could actually be the head of government. Ruskin doesn't mention this, but Walpole was never formally deposed by the House of Commons. He resigned because there was a vote of no confidence in the Commons. He actually survived the no confidence vote, as I have pointed out in the notes, but he saw this as a personal repudiation and resigned. And I'll talk about this later on in France when President de Gaulle resigned because the people rejected one of his referenda. De Gaulle said, well, if the French people reject my ideas, they reject me, and the people do no longer deserve me, and de Gaulle resigned. I'll talk about that more in France later. Now, Ruskin points out that there were two distinct differences between Walpole and his successors, the early prime ministers, and today's prime ministers. The first one is originally the king selected the ministers in the cabinet. Of course, today the prime minister selects all of the ministers for the cabinet. And I don't even remember exactly how long that has been, but it's been well over a century. Secondly, the cabinet was originally responsible to the King of England. The king appointed the prime minister and the cabinet members, and of course today the prime minister is selected by the parliament. The prime minister is responsible to the parliament, in this case the House of Commons, and then the prime minister selects the cabinet members. Now, one thing that is not mentioned in Ruskin that I think is important is if you're wondering, well, when did the cabinet begin to look more modern? It's after what many call the First Reform Act, or others call it the Reform Bill of 1832. The Reform Bill first said that the cabinet should be composed of members drawn from the party that holds a majority of the seats in the House of Commons. And this really did create a major impetus to party governments. This came along with really the first significant expansion of the voting electorate. I'll talk about that on the next page. Second, that cabinet members are collectively responsible to the House of Commons for the conduct of their government and not to the king. And what this meant and still means today, so this still has application even in 2021, is that the cabinet now needs to maintain majority support in the House of Commons to stay in power. If the prime minister and the government lose that majority, then that government can be toppled in what's called a vote of no confidence. So the cabinet and party system really are intertwined, and I concluded the page with something that I find intriguing, and that is it's been over a century, since 1902, that all prime ministers have come from the Commons. Before then, prime ministers could actually come from the House of Lords or not even be a member of a legislative body at all. We turn to the expansion of suffrage, the Reform Acts, and you will see a lot of parallels to the expansion of suffrage in the United States, and that is next. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening, everyone. Take care.